Oh God, in 7 years, I have never once heard my son laugh. Ethan Cole stood frozen at the doorway, his heart clenched tight. Since the day his wife passed away, the vast mansion had been drowned in icy silence. He had gone through 7 nannies only to despairingly dismiss each one because no one could stay by Leo's side for more than 2 weeks. Billions of dollars, dozens of doctors, the most advanced medical technology, all of it was meaningless. His son, Leo, was born into darkness, living in absolute silence. Every morning the father sat alone across from the small chair, yearning for a glance, a smile, a single word. But in return, there was only an invisible emptiness gnawing at his heart. He asked himself, had he failed as a father? And then, tonight, the impossible happened. An ordinary woman stepped in. No white lab coat, no prestigious degrees, only an old piano. And from that very moment, everything began to change. What was it that made the boy laugh for the first time after 7 years of silence? All right then, my dear audience, if you're watching and find this story intriguing, comment 1 or I'm still here to continue listening. That evening was unlike any other. The helicopter carried the lonely man back to his vast mansion where silence had long become the prevailing music. The whir of its blades stirred the air above the rooftop helipad, sweeping away the thin veil of mist in a Silicon Valley morning. In that moment, Ethan Cole appeared, tailored suit immaculate, silver-streaked hair combed neatly back, the sharp gaze of a man who once sealed billion-dollar deals with a single nod. He had once been the technology genius, a name tied to TED Talks, to Forbes covers gleaming with prestige, to grand parties where everyone longed to stand beside him. But tonight, the helicopter did not take him to a global summit, nor to meet any head of state. Behind the glow of media glory, Ethan had only one role left, that of a single father. 7 years ago, he lost the only woman who had given his world meaning. His wife's death in a difficult childbirth left a wound that never healed and left him a son whom the medical world called a rare case. Leo was born without light in his eyes, his body scarcely responding to the world around him. The doctors delivered their verdict coldly: congenital blindness combined with neurodevelopmental disorder. To them, he was only a complicated file. To Ethan, he was the entire universe. The man who once commanded global teams of engineers began his own private war. He poured billions into research, brought scientists from Tokyo, Zurich, and Boston to live within his mansion. The house of thousands of square meters turned into a miniature hospital, corridors lined with monitoring screens, the living room converted into a therapy chamber filled with machines worth millions. Even the garden ceased to be a place for flowers, instead becoming a testing ground for light, sound, and every cutting-edge neurological intervention. All for one hope alone, to hear just once Leo say Dad. But 7 years passed, and all that answered his efforts was a chilling silence. Leo had never once laughed. His clouded eyes never sought another gaze. His small hands had never reached out of their own will for warmth. In that mansion, the beeping of machines became the ticking of a merciless clock, but the sound of a child was nowhere to be found. Even the most renowned experts, after months of living there, quietly departed with eyes filled with helplessness. Night after night, Ethan sat before the monitors, watching the steady rhythm of his son's heartbeat. He once thought he had grown accustomed to those blue and red lines, yet in truth, each stroke cut thin slices into his heart. Every steady line, instead of bringing comfort, became a cruel reminder. His son was there, but his inner world was impossibly out of reach. Ethan had once possessed everything: power, wealth, influence. He commanded, and thousands in Silicon Valley obeyed. But faced with a motionless child in a wheelchair, he could do nothing more than crouch down, touch that cold little hand, and whisper meaningless stories to fill the emptiness. Stories of rain against the window, of tense meetings that afternoon, or some trivial detail from the financial news. All of it fell into the void. And the bitterest irony, The man praised for connecting the world with technology was powerless before the single meter of distance between himself and his son, a distance no wealth could bridge. Sometimes he thought of the press conferences, of investors applauding wildly when he promised to bring artificial intelligence closer to the human heart. If they could see him now, they would realize he could not even reach the heart of the one child he loved most. At night, the mansion lights blazed golden, but they could not warm the air. Ethan stood in the long hallway, staring up at his wife's portrait. He had once promised her he would raise Leo in happiness. Now, each time he looked into those gentle eyes, he saw only the reflection of a broken vow. At times, he wished he could collapse. Yet every morning, he repeated the same ritual, preparing breakfast, placing the plate before Leo, smiling as though speaking to an ordinary boy. In that smile there was strength, but beneath it, a pain no success could ever conceal. Ethan longed for only one simple thing: connection. A touch in return, a whispered sound, or the faintest smile. Yet all these years, there had been nothing but emptiness. And still, might it be possible that from within that very emptiness, an unexpected door could someday open? The heavy wooden door creaked open, its hinges sighing softly in the gleaming hall. Sophia Reyes, 29, stood still for a few seconds before stepping inside. Her worn canvas shoes seemed almost out of place against the cold marble floor. The scent of the mansion was unmistakable, clean, orderly, but so quiet it felt as though the place was not meant for the living. To Sophia, the first impression was like walking into a museum, except here, every frame, every object radiated the absence of human breath. She had once been a promising young musician, with nights spent at the piano believing her hands would someday touch the grand stage. But a family tragedy shattered those dreams. Now, Sophia chose to begin again, with the smallest of steps, applying for work as a housemaid, to have a place, a roof, and the hope of feeling useful again. At first, the work was dull to the point of monotony. She wiped down the long dining table that rarely saw guests, cooked dishes that were hardly ever touched, rearranged a living room that was already too perfectly in order. But when she passed by Leo's room, she noticed something unusual. The boy did not speak, did not look, only sat motionless in his small chair. Yet, whenever music played from the television, or a faint tune drifting from Sophia's phone, his chest seemed to rise differently, slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to suggest a breath shifting its rhythm. Where all the previous nannies had tried to call Leo's name, gently shake his shoulder, or repeat syllables that never earned a reply, Sophia did the opposite. She did not touch the boy, did not demand, did not insist. Instead, she sat quietly in the corner of the room, opened a piano app on her phone, and let the notes fall softly into the silence. Sometimes, she even smiled to herself, as if she were playing for the quiet itself to hear. At first, nothing changed. Leo remained motionless, his clouded eyes adrift in some unreachable world. But Sophia persisted. Day after day, she noticed the smallest movements, a finger curling faintly, a subtle tilt of the head. To her, these were signals. To anyone else, perhaps they were nothing. But Sophia believed there was a door within the boy, waiting only for the right rhythm to be knocked. One afternoon, pale golden sunlight streamed through the glass windows, spilling across the floor like liquid honey. Sophia paused in the living room. Before her stood an old piano, its ivory keys yellowed and dulled with dust. She reached out, her fingers trembling as though greeting an old friend. The sound that emerged was imperfect, slightly off tune, but startling in the stillness of the room. At that very moment, Leo, seated silently in the corner, tilted his head. Just a small motion, but to Sophia it was like lightning tearing through the night. The boy, who had been unmoved by hundreds of expensive therapies, now responded, however faintly, to the imperfect sound of an old piano. Sophia froze, her heart racing. She dared not cry out, nor summon Ethan. She simply sat down and pressed a few more keys. The humble melody drifted through the air, while Leo continued to incline his head as though that sound had cracked open a secret doorway just for him. From that day, Sophia's routine changed. Each time she cleaned the living room, she paused to play a few notes. Not much, not long, just enough to lace the silence of the house with a warmer echo. She expected nothing. She simply observed. And the more she observed, the more certain she became. Leo was listening, in his own way. To outsiders, it was mere coincidence. But to someone who had once lived by music, Sophia knew, no sound ever disappeared without leaving a trace. And somewhere within this child's soul, music had planted its first seed. What billions of dollars, dozens of doctors, and the most advanced machines could not achieve had begun with the humble sound of an old piano and the quiet patience of an ordinary woman. Could this be the very first key to unlocking Leo's silence? In the days that followed, music began to seep into every corner of the mansion. No longer was it a house echoing only with machines or solitary footsteps for each afternoon. From the living room came brief melodies, soft and steady. Sophia never let them linger too long. She knew Leo was easily overwhelmed, so she released the notes sparingly, like small shards of light dropped upon still water. She experimented with different approaches. When she played the lower notes, Leo's breathing slowed, as if his body were gently unwinding. When she struck higher ones, his fingers twitched, sometimes jerking faintly as though reaching outward. Sophia did not keep charts or reports. She simply remembered, like a cautious explorer tracing fragile tracks through a dark forest. And then, one ordinary afternoon became a milestone. The last light of day stretched golden across the wooden floor, bathing the old piano in honeyed glow. Sophia sat there, her fingers tapping a simple four-quarters rhythm steady, unadorned, like footsteps crossing an empty field. Leo, as usual, sat in his chair by the window. No one expected anything different. But when Sophia shifted to a brighter chord, something unimaginable happened. From where the boy sat came a faint, fleeting sound, a quiet laugh. It was not loud, not clear, almost slipping past awareness, but it was a laugh. At the doorway, Ethan had just returned from the office. He froze, clutching the wooden frame, his eyes wide in disbelief. For 7 years he had lived in absolute silence, his heart hardened against hope, and now, with nothing more than a few notes, his son laughed. Ethan did not rush in, did not cry out. He feared breaking the fragile moment. He only stood still, eyes welling, heart clenched as though revived. And Sophia? She did not stop, did not celebrate. Her fingers moved calmly over the keys, her face composed, as if that laugh were the most natural thing in the world. Deep down, she knew that overreaction could send Leo retreating back into his cocoon of silence. So she played on, gently, letting the music carry that laugh into the air longer than any doctor had ever managed. Ethan watched her quietly. In the sunset's glow, the small figure seated at the old piano radiated a patience he had never seen in anyone. Not a doctor, not an expert, but this ordinary woman had opened the first door into Leo's soul. That laugh was brief, but it burned into his heart like a brand of fire, reminding him his son was not an empty void. The boy was there, waiting for the right rhythm to speak. Ethan sighed, his hand trembling as he let go of the frame. Sadness, hope, and gratitude swelled together, choking his throat. For the first time in years, he ceased blaming himself, ceased resenting the billions wasted. Because in the end, the key had not been in a lab, but in the trembling notes of an old piano and the quiet patience of a woman whose heart bore wounds as deep as his own. Outside the window, the evening sun sank into the still garden. Inside, music lingered not loud, but strong enough to preserve the moment. Ethan closed his eyes, wondering, was this merely a spark destined to fade, or the beginning of a new chapter in his son's life? All right then, My dear audience, are you still here? If so, take a moment to hit subscribe and continue following this story. And I would love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? The heavy wooden door creaked as it opened, a faint rasp echoing through the gleaming office. Sophia Reyes, 29, stepped in with the simple intention of tidying up quickly before leaving. Sunlight poured through the tall glass window, reflecting off amber-colored bookshelves, casting the room in a space both majestic and cold. The office, kept so meticulously ordered it felt almost devoid of life, revealed something unexpected today. As she pulled open the last drawer, Sophia's hand brushed against a thick file, its cover yellowed with age. At first, she meant only to rearrange it, but as she flipped through a few pages, her eyes froze on the stark printed words. Suppress neurological responses, reduce motor activity for easier control, gradual increase of sedative dosage. The more she read, the faster her heart raced. This was no ordinary treatment plan. It was a record of invasive neurological experiments using Leo's small body as the testing ground. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she turned to the final page of notes. Names of top doctors, colossal figures in the payment column, and under result, a single word: failure. Nowhere was there mention of safety, joy, or Leo's quality of life. Everything was as cold as a statistical ledger. Sophia's stomach twisted. For weeks she had witnessed Ethan, a powerless father, desperate to help his child. And now she had to face the truth. All those efforts, all that money, had turned Leo into nothing more than a subject for men in white coats who claimed the authority of expertise. That afternoon when Ethan returned, Sophia did not hide the file as she might have before. She placed it squarely on the desk, beneath the full weight of the sunlight. Ethan entered, startled for a moment, then approached. When he opened the first page, his hand shook. He read line after line as though carving deep wounds into his own heart. Phrases like behavioral suppression and sensory reduction blurred his vision. The man who once commanded a corporation worth tens of billions, who had signed deals that shook the global tech market, now trembled before papers he himself had unwittingly authorized. He remembered the days he signed treatment consents, believing he was doing the best for his son. But the truth struck mercilessly. He had allowed his child to become an experiment in the hands of cold-hearted professionals. Ethan collapsed into a chair, his hands covering his face. In that moment, he was no longer the tech genius, no longer the man who graced the cover of Forbes. He was only a desperate father, crushed under the mountain of his own guilt. Sophia stood quietly at the side, her heart aching with every heavy breath he drew. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he had been misled by white coats and their polished promises. But she knew in this moment Ethan needed to face the truth himself. Silence filled the room. Only the ticking of the wall clock remained, reminding them that each passing second carried its own burden of pain. Slowly, Ethan lifted his head, his eyes red. He stared out the window, where tree branches swayed in the wind, and asked himself, for 7 years, what have I truly done for my son? The weight of guilt pressed upon his chest, dragging his shoulders down. Yet, within that despair flickered another thought. If Sophia could awaken Leo's first laugh with nothing more than an old piano, then perhaps another path existed. A path not paved with clinical charts and sterile machines, but with patience, presence, and real love. Outside the room, small footsteps echoed. Leo had unconsciously wandered near the doorway. Ethan caught his son's reflection in the glass, a second knife in his heart. The innocent child was still there, alive, breathing, waiting for him. He drew in a long breath, his hand gripping the file tightly. In his eyes now glimmered a new resolve. The past could not be undone, but the future was still within reach. The only question was, did Ethan have the courage to abandon the familiar road of power and, together with Sophia, carve out an entirely different path for his son? On a night of pouring rain, as thunder rumbled across the Manhattan sky, the light in Ethan's office still burned. On the desk, stacks of files lay open beside a laptop filled with scanned documents and notes. Sophia sat nearby, her hair damp and clinging to her face from running back from the library with more evidence in hand. No longer the timid housemaid bathed in the golden lamplight, she looked every bit like a true ally, ready to fight a battle Ethan had never imagined himself waging. Ethan, the man who once stood in tailored suits before thousands of investors, now wore a wrinkled shirt, dark circles under his eyes, but his gaze blazed with clarity. He typed email after email, saved file after file, as though every skill from his business empire was reborn not to build a dynasty but to save his son. They chose to reach out to a renowned investigative journalist, one who had once brought a pharmaceutical giant to its knees in the name of justice. When Ethan hit send on the email, evidence attached, his heart pounded as fiercely as it had the day he signed his very first contract. But this time, his counterpart was not the market, it was the truth. Just days later, the first exposé appeared on the front page of a major newspaper. The headline blazed in red, "Medical experiments in disguise, children used as test subjects." The story sent shockwaves. Television channels, radio stations, and social media erupted with Ethan Cole's name not as the tech genius, but as the father who dared to speak. And then, something unexpected happened. Families across the country began to come forward. They shared heartbreaking stories, children overdosed with drugs, strapped to chairs, abandoned in cold laboratories. The truth poured out like a flood. Ethan and Sophia followed each testimony, their hearts torn yet strangely relieved they were not alone. Finally, a congressional hearing was convened. The image was broadcast live across America. Ethan stepped onto the podium, no expensive jacket, no icy composure. He stood trembling, eyes red. His voice cracked as he looked into the cameras and spoke not as a CEO, but as a father. "My son doesn't need an experiment. He needs to be heard. He needs a melody." The words were brief, but they rang out like music that pierced the hearts of millions. Across living rooms in America, people sat frozen and then broke into tears. The man once celebrated for his intellect was now honored for his vulnerability. Sophia sat in the back, her vision blurred with tears, her hands gripping the chair. She knew this moment was not just for Ethan or for Leo. It was for every child who had never been heard. The media exploded. Talk shows invited Ethan to speak. Images of him breaking down spread across newspapers, and the stories of other victimized families became the center of nationwide debate. A movement was born, demanding stricter oversight of medical research. The pressure mounted beyond denial. The group of doctors came under investigation, their licenses revoked. Some faced heavy sentences. Public fury burned, but in the tragedy, people also found a symbol of hope. A father who admitted his failures and vowed to protect his son at all costs. When the hearing ended, Ethan stepped down the marble steps into a light drizzle. Leo was not there, but in his heart, the memory of his son's first laugh by the old piano still echoed. Sophia walked beside him, quiet yet steady. Surrounded by reporters, he said nothing more. He only held the file tightly in his hand, clutching a piece of the truth he swore would never again be buried. But could justice alone mend the wounds carved into him and his son? And now that the door of truth had been forced open, what awaited this fragile family's life? My dear audience, are you still here? Take a pause, grab a glass of water, and come back for what's ahead. If you found this story compelling, comment 1 below. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next part. On the first morning after the hearing, the mansion awoke to something different. Gone were the pounding phone calls from reporters, the urgent knocks from lawyers. Only golden sunlight streamed through the curtains, falling across the piano, now marked with tiny handprints, and from it came a new sound, the steady tapping of small, trembling hands. Leo sat on a low chair, his body leaning slightly forward, 2 fingers brushing against 3 keys. The sounds were clumsy, uneven, but to Ethan they roared like thunder. The man who once ruled the world of technology trembled, his shoulders shaking, eyes blurring with tears. Sophia stood nearby, her smile warm. She did not intervene, did not instruct. She simply listened like the first audience to a song yet unnamed. In the days that followed, change came little by little. When Sophia played simple melodies, Leo began to tap along, sometimes with his fingers, other times drumming lightly against the chair. At first it was vague noise, but then, between the scattered beats, came fragile syllables. Pa, no. Another time, when Ethan leaned close, a faint voice escaped Leo's lips. Da, dee. It pierced Ethan's heart like a blade, but the pain gave way to overwhelming joy. He wept, not from despair, but from a happiness so immense he had long thought unattainable. The boy who had lived in silence was trying to call him by a single word. The mansion, once haunted by cold stillness, now pulsed with a new symphony. Piano notes mingled with soft laughter, clumsy words, the hurried footsteps of a father unwilling to miss a moment. The grand, lifeless space had become a stage for life, where every sound carried meaning. Sophia slowly became the soul of the house. No longer a maid, no longer an outsider. She was patient with Leo each day, encouraging him with her smile, accepting both his silences and his tiny victories. Sometimes, while cleaning, she deliberately tapped a wrong rhythm, prompting Leo to laugh as if correcting her music. Those moments were small, but they glowed brightly, pieces of a mosaic Ethan etched into his heart. Ethan, once a powerless father, began to learn the art of letting go. Instead of forcing control, he sat beside his son, allowing Leo's fingers to lead. He even let Sophia tease, "You play worse than Leo." And for the first time, he laughed aloud, a sound so unexpected that it startled even him. Not only music, but daily life itself transformed. At breakfast, instead of heavy silence, Leo tapped his spoon on the table to make rhythm. Sophia added a gentle hum, and Ethan clapped along. There they sat, an impromptu family band in the very kitchen that had once been so cold. Hope was no longer distant. It lived in every breathless giggle, every clumsy note, every time Leo reached for Sophia's hand or brushed against Ethan's shoulder. Small gestures, yet filled with rebirth. Outside, the media still clamored over the medical scandal. But inside the mansion, another story was being written. The story of a child discovering his voice, of a father relearning how to love, and of an ordinary woman becoming the center of a new family. And then, one evening, as the sunset gilded the living room in gold, Leo struck 4 consecutive notes. The sounds were imperfect, but they carried rhythm, intention. Sophia held her breath. Ethan shot upright in his seat. It was no longer imitation. Leo was beginning to create music of his own. The first sound in the Los Angeles concert hall was not from the piano, but from the pounding hearts of thousands holding their breath. On stage, under brilliant lights, a slender teenager sat upright before the grand piano. His hair fell softly, his face glowed, yet his eyes remained deep pools of darkness. This was Leo Cole. At 14, the boy who had lived in silence for 7 years now sat at the center of America's attention. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling as though testing his strength against the world. Then suddenly, a chord rang out bold, resolute. The note lingered, slicing through the heavy silence like a blade. The audience jolted, then locked their gaze on the boy. Leo began to play the first piece he had ever composed himself. Each note was a step from darkness into light. At times the melody was somber, recalling years of muteness. At times it pulsed wildly like the heartbeat of a child laughing for the first time. Then it soared, radiant, like the sun breaking through after a storm. Every strike of the keys declared, "I am still here. I never disappeared." In the front row, Sophia sat motionless, her hands clasped tight, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked at her boy, the child who once tilted his head toward a few clumsy piano notes in a cold mansion, now transformed into a true artist. Beside her, Ethan had risen without realizing. His hand rested over his chest, overflowing with pride and penance. He had once spent billions on technology, yet in the end, what saved his son was an old piano and an ordinary woman who refused to give up. When the final note struck, the hall fell silent. Time seemed to stop. Then, thunderous applause erupted, rolling like a storm, unending. Many wiped their tears. Some embraced each other. No one saw him as the blind billionaire's son anymore. Before them stood an artist, living proof of the power of perseverance. Leo rose, taking the microphone. His hand trembled, but his voice rang clear. "My light does not come from my eyes. It comes from music, from this piano, and from those who never gave up on me." A sacred stillness filled the hall, every gaze fixed upon him. Then, applause burst forth again, louder, fiercer, overflowing with emotion. Sophia's shoulders shook, tears cascading like a stream. Ethan lifted his head, eyes glistening, but with a smile, the smile of a father who had finally heard the call of his son's heart. From that moment, Leo's story spread across the media. He was no longer called the blind billionaire's son, but the artist who found light in the darkness. Articles praised him, clips went viral, millions shared his performance. But for Sophia and Ethan, titles meant nothing. What mattered was that Leo had stepped out of silence, found his own language, and dared to stand in the light of the world. The hall still echoed with applause, but in the minds of the three, only one sound remained: the melody of love, patience, and unyielding faith. The story of Ethan, Sophia, and Leo reminds us of something that seems simple, yet is profoundly true. It is not wealth or advanced technology, but patience, presence, and genuine love that can open the doors of the human heart. Leo has found his own light, not through his eyes, but through the melodies flowing from the piano. Yet this is not the end. The future still lies ahead. Will he go on to conquer even greater stages? Or will this very journey lead Ethan and Sophia into new trials, where their family must face not only the world outside, but also the secrets and limits within themselves? That question remains unanswered, opening the way for the next chapter. The lesson here is clear. Sometimes, what changes a life forever does not come from grand designs, but from the smallest of moments, a hand reaching out, a sudden melody, a single choice not to give up. And within silence that seems powerless, there is always a voice waiting to be heard. If this story has touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from and at what time. Share this video with your family and friends across the United States so they too can feel the healing power of love and music. And don't forget to leave a comment below. Do you want to see part 2 of this story? Perhaps the next chapter is the very journey you've been waiting for.